A sudden blast of Canadian air just slammed into the middle of the country in the middle of summer, and meteorologists say this cold snap isn't just an oddity. It's about to get considerably more intense before it finally breaks. Here's exactly what's driving this unusual late August cold, why it's colliding so dramatically with the heat still gripping the southern half of the country, and what forecasters are now saying comes next. Let's start with what's actually happening on the ground right now, because the timing alone makes this genuinely unusual. Late August almost always still feels firmly like summer across most of the Midwest and Great Lakes region. Instead, a surge of unseasonably cold air has pushed temperatures across parts of northern Wisconsin and Michigan's Upper Peninsula down into the low 40s, readings that would be considered a normal October morning, rather than something arriving before Labor Day. One meteorologist tracking the pattern closely, Max Schuster, who hosts the Max Velocity Severe Weather Center, described this as a major weather shift that he believes much of the public simply isn't prepared for, precisely because of how sharply it contrasts with what late August typically brings. That contrast is really the heart of this entire story. While this blast of Canadian air pushes into the Midwest and Great Lakes, intense heat has remained firmly locked in place over Texas and Oklahoma, creating what Schuster called a genuine weather battleground stretching across the middle of the country. On one side of that battle line, communities are waking up to temperatures better suited to fall jackets. On the other, triple-digit heat continues baking the southern plains without any real sign of relief. That kind of sharp divide between two dramatically different air masses, sitting side by side, rarely stays calm for long. And it's exactly the kind of setup that tends to produce genuinely dangerous severe weather right along the boundary where the two collide. If you're finding this breakdown useful, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this kind of weather coverage reach the people who need to actually plan around it. And that's precisely what's unfolding. Forecasters have been tracking a low pressure system moving through southern Canada that's expected to help spark rotating supercell thunderstorms across Minnesota, with meteorologists specifically flagging enough wind shear in the atmosphere to support at least a low tornado threat alongside those storms. The most likely window for that activity was expected to begin building around 5 o'clock Central. Time and continue developing into the evening hours, with forecasters watching for 1 or 2 rotating supercells capable of producing damaging winds as the primary overall concern, even with the tornado risk layered on top. Just to the south and west of that Minnesota threat, an entirely separate cluster of severe thunderstorms has been forming across Nebraska, and this cluster carries its own distinct set of dangers. Straight-line winds within these storms have been forecast to reach as high as 75 miles per hour, strong enough to snap tree limbs, damage roofing, and knock down power lines across a wide swath of the state. Alongside those damaging winds, forecasters have also flagged the potential for isolated large to very large hail, the kind capable of causing real damage to vehicles, siding, and crops still standing in the field this late in the growing season. These 2 separate storm clusters, one over Minnesota and one over Nebraska, illustrate something important about how this kind of sharply contrasting air mass boundary tends to behave. Rather than producing one single uniform line of storms, the collision between genuinely cold Canadian air and the warm, humid air still lingering ahead of it tends to spark multiple distinct rounds of severe weather across a broad geographic area, each one drawing on slightly different atmospheric ingredients, depending on exactly where the boundary sits at any given moment. That's part of why meteorologists were tracking the system so closely across an unusually wide stretch of the northern and central plains, rather than issuing a single, narrowly targeted warning for just one specific area. So why is this particular cold intrusion arriving with this much intensity? And why now, in the final week of August, rather than during the fall months when this kind of pattern would feel far more ordinary? The mechanism driving it comes down to a dip in the jet stream, the fast-moving river of air high in the atmosphere that generally separates colder polar air to the north from warmer air further south. When that jet stream buckles southward, as it has this week, it effectively opens a direct pathway for genuinely cold Canadian air to plunge much further south than it typically would at this point in the calendar. Earlier long-range guidance had actually flagged this kind of pattern shift weeks in advance, with forecasts back in early August pointing toward a strong weather pattern capable of sending significantly cooler air from Canada into the central and eastern United States, while the western states remained locked under a warmer ridge of high pressure, essentially the exact split that's now playing out in real time. Here's where the story genuinely does get worse, rather than simply resolving back to normal late August conditions. Updated forecast guidance valid for Friday, August 28th, shows an even more pronounced area of below normal temperatures, settling over the Midwest, the Central Plains, and the Ohio Valley, with departures running as much as 16 to 20 degrees below the seasonal average, sitting right at the core of that anomaly. That signal doesn't stay contained to the upper Midwest either. It extends from the Central Plains eastward through the Ohio Valley and into parts of the Northeast, meaning this isn't simply a brief, localized dip confined to one or two states, but a broader, more expansive cold intrusion working its way across a substantial stretch of the eastern half of the country. The practical impact of that kind of anomaly is genuinely striking for this time of year. Forecasters say this potential cold air intrusion could be strong enough to push overnight lows into the 50s across parts of the affected region by late August, numbers that represent a notably early sign of fall arriving well ahead of schedule. For context, an overnight low in the 50s during the final days of August would typically be considered unusual even for early October across much of the same stretch of the Midwest and Ohio Valley, let alone for a date still solidly inside what most people consider peak summer. Meanwhile, the western half of the country continues telling an almost entirely opposite story. That same updated forecast guidance shows the western United States running the reverse pattern, with well above normal temperatures, spreading across much of the desert southwest and the Rockies, and anomalies reaching as high as 20 to 24 degrees above the seasonal average in some locations. That kind of stark east-west split, one half of the country running nearly 20 degrees below normal while the other runs nearly 25 degrees above it, reflects just how dramatically the jet stream has buckled this particular week, carving the country into two genuinely different climate zones, operating almost like separate seasons entirely. This kind of pronounced split pattern isn't just a curiosity for meteorologists to note in passing. It carries real practical consequences for anyone traveling or making plans across these regions in the coming days. A trip that starts in the sweltering heat of the desert southwest and ends in the upper Midwest could realistically involve packing for two entirely different seasons within the same week, something travelers might not think to plan around given how unusual this particular pattern is for late August. Agricultural operations, spanning both regions, face similarly complicated planning challenges, since irrigation and harvest timing decisions, calibrated for one set of seasonal expectations, can be thrown off considerably when actual conditions swing this far from the norm in opposite directions simultaneously. So what actually comes next, once this initial wave of cold and severe weather works its way through? The near-term picture, according to the latest guidance, suggests this specific cool snap won't linger indefinitely over the Midwest and Great Lakes. Forecasters expect the dip in the jet stream responsible for pulling this cold air southward to begin moving back out of the region starting around August 26th, which would allow warmer, more humid air to gradually return east of the Rockies in its wake. Next week's broader outlook shows above-average temperatures expected to spread back across most of the country east of the Rockies, with the clear exception of the Northeast, where conditions are forecast to settle back closer to a more typical seasonal range rather than swinging sharply in either direction. That timeline matters because it suggests this entire episode functions less like a single, simple cold snap and more like two connected waves arriving in relatively close succession. The first wave, the one already pushing temperatures into the 40s across northern Wisconsin and Michigan's Upper Peninsula and fueling this week's severe thunderstorm threat across Minnesota and Nebraska, represents the leading edge of this pattern. The second, more expansive wave, the one forecasters are now flagging for around August 28th, with those 16 to 20 degree departures stretching from the Central Plains through the Ohio Valley and into the Northeast, represents a genuinely stronger reinforcement of that same underlying cold intrusion, arriving just as the first wave might otherwise have been expected to fade. It's worth understanding why forecasters are treating the second wave as the more significant part of the story, even though the first wave is what's grabbing attention right now with its severe weather threat. A single day of unusually cool temperatures rarely reshapes how people think about an entire season. A second, more widespread cold intrusion arriving within roughly a week of the first, and pushing the anomaly even further below normal across a broader geographic footprint, starts to look less like an isolated fluke and more like a genuine pattern shift. Exactly the kind of signal meteorologists watch for when trying to determine whether a particular stretch of unusual weather represents a passing anomaly or the early edge of a more significant seasonal transition. There's also a broader context worth keeping in mind here, because this year has already produced its share of genuinely extreme temperature swings on both ends of the spectrum. The same year that's now delivering this unusually early cold intrusion also experienced a brutal, prolonged winter cold wave back in January and February, when a sudden stratospheric warming event pushed the polar vortex dramatically southward across North America, driving temperatures as low as nearly negative 44 degrees Fahrenheit in parts of Ontario, and bringing snow as far south as Texas and Florida before that pattern finally relaxed. That earlier cold wave caused billions of dollars in damage and dozens of fatalities across Canada, the United States, and Mexico, a reminder that this year's atmospheric pattern has already shown a genuine tendency toward sharp, sometimes extreme swings, rather than settling into smooth, predictable seasonal transitions the way an average year typically would. None of that history guarantees this particular late August cold snap will reach anything close to that earlier winter event's severity, and forecasters aren't suggesting anything of the sort. Temperatures during this current stretch aren't expected to approach freezing across the affected Midwest and Great Lakes region, even during the coldest overnight hours. But the broader pattern of volatility, sharp regional contrasts, and unusually early seasonal transitions arriving well ahead of their typical calendar window, is exactly the kind of signal that keeps meteorologists like Schuster describing this week's shift in the terms he chose, a genuine weather battleground that much of the public simply hasn't had time to mentally prepare for, given how quickly it's developed relative to typical late August expectations. Longer-range seasonal outlooks looking ahead toward the coming fall and winter have separately flagged the potential for an unusually severe pattern developing across parts of the country as well, tied to expectations of a strong El Nino influence in the Pacific, with some early guidance suggesting states including California, Colorado, Nebraska, Nevada, and Oregon could see notably heavier snowfall than usual once winter fully arrives, even as this particular late August cold snap remains a comparatively modest preview by comparison. For anyone living across the affected stretch of the Midwest, Great Lakes, Central Plains, and Ohio Valley, the practical guidance heading into the coming days is fairly straightforward. Keep an eye on evolving forecast updates rather than assuming this week's chill represents the full extent of what's coming, since the more significant cold intrusion currently flagged for around August 28th hasn't fully arrived yet as of this recording. Anyone in Minnesota or Nebraska specifically should stay alert to the ongoing severe thunderstorm threat, including the potential for damaging straight-line winds, large hail, and an isolated tornado risk tied to the rotating supercells forecasters have been tracking. And residents across the broader region experiencing this unusually early taste of fall weather should recognize that the warm-up expected to follow later next week doesn't necessarily mean this pattern is finished evolving, particularly given how this same year has already demonstrated a tendency towards sudden, dramatic temperature swings, arriving well outside their typical seasonal windows, from January's brutal polar vortex intrusion all the way through this week's genuinely unusual late summer chill. If you want to stay ahead of exactly how this pattern continues developing, whether that second wave of cold arrives as strong as current guidance suggests, and how quickly the warm-up that follows actually takes hold, subscribing means you won't miss the next update the moment forecasters confirm the details. Because, based on everything meteorologists are currently tracking, this cold snap is still actively evolving rather than finished, and the next several days look set to bring exactly the kind of sharp, geographically split weather pattern that makes late August in this particular year anything but ordinary, with severe storms on one flank, an unusually early taste of fall on another, and a stretch of genuinely record-breaking heat holding firm in between.